So, have you ever looked at a perfectly polished graph online and felt like something was just off? Well, welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving headfirst into the surreal and honestly kind of chaotic landscape of modern data visualization. Our source material today breaks down a piece of media that is quite literally a masterclass in manipulation. We're going to navigate this data hellscape together, a place where deception doesn't yell at you in all caps. Instead, it wears a very calm, cool, and collected mask. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the anatomy of manipulation. Then we'll dig into some specific tactics, cherry-picking the data, distorting the visuals, and framing and preloading. We'll follow that up with the illusion of evidence before finally escaping the data hellscape. Section 1. The anatomy of manipulation, the subtle art of deception. You know, the most dangerous online manipulation out there isn't brute force propaganda. It is incredibly subtle. Just look at this number. 461,000. That is the staggering view count of the deceptively calm video analyzed in our source material. This massive scale really highlights the reach of these subtle framing tricks. It's being fed by algorithms to hundreds of thousands of people, which makes the deception incredibly effective. As the source notes, this video is a masterclass in very subtle manipulations, a calm, collected guy helping you understand the world better. And that's exactly it. A manipulator's greatest weapon isn't outrage. It's appearing entirely reasonable. By presenting data calmly, the presenter completely bypasses our critical defenses, quietly pushing a specific agenda without us even realizing we're being led. Section 2. Tactic, cherry-picking the data, finding the flaw. Okay, so let's look at the very first tactic in this manipulator's playbook, broad brushing. It basically happens in 3 steps. Step 1. Find a single, flawed, or maybe just confusing graph out of the tens of thousands of accurate ones out there. Step 2, correct that specific graph so the data looks slightly less alarming. And then, step 3, use this singular instance to falsely claim that literally all scientific data in the field is manipulated. Our source points out how finding just one obscure chart is weaponized to paint an entire community of researchers as a bunch of alarmists. Section 3, tactic, distorting the visuals. The Garden of Earthly Deceptions. This is where basic math gets completely twisted up. Think about the standard metric used by actual scientists, the global average surface temperature anomaly. It's super straightforward and just tracks how temperatures vary from a historical baseline. But then look at the manipulated metric, ratios of record highs to record low daily temperatures. The source highlights how this incredibly convoluted ratio is strategically chosen for one reason: to flatten out alarming trends and just confuse the viewer. But why exactly is that ratio metric so deceptive? Well, the source breaks down 3 hidden variables. First, the addition of new weather stations since 1850. That means there are simply way more places that can even record highs. Second, the sheer time elapse makes historical records inherently harder to break. And third, actual rising global temperatures. When you mix all 3 of those into a single ratio, it becomes a mathematical sleight of hand that completely hides the physical truth. Oh, and here's another incredibly sneaky visual distortion trick: visual stretching. Basically, you take a graph, elongate its axis to squish the data downward, and then draw an entirely arbitrary trend line. In the analyzed source, there's this wild yellow trend line that just magically stops right before the data starts looking too scary. It completely avoids actual statistical modeling just to minimize an otherwise alarming spike in the raw numbers. Section 4. Tactic, framing and preloading. Poisoning the well. All right, let's move from math to psychology. This is all about the words spoken before a graph is even shown. We call this title preloading, which is assigning credibility-enhancing titles to your allies while purposefully using diminishing titles for your opponents. The source notes a perfect example of this, calling an allied voice a theoretical physicist to make them sound highly objective, while dismissing an opposing, incredibly accomplished climate scientist as merely a climate activist. It instantly biases who you're going to inherently trust. Then there's another powerful tactic called low salience framing. This means deliberately focusing the audience on the absolute least threatening aspect of a massive problem. The source points out how the manipulative media focuses heavily on fewer cold days. And honestly, hearing fewer cold days tricks the brain into feeling cozy. But this framing entirely ignores the catastrophic disruption to global infrastructure, water supplies, and agriculture that a rapidly warming planet actually causes. Section 5. The illusion of evidence, smoke, and mirrors. So, when we strip away all the smoke and mirrors, how do these claims actually hold up against objective reality? Contrast the manipulators' confusing ratios with this undeniable timeline. 1850s, the Industrial Revolution begins. 1990s, carbon emissions visibly accelerate. Today, a continuous, compounding rise in global CO2. Honest analysis tracks this actual reality rather than hiding behind distorted geometry. Notice the massive disconnect here. The manipulators claim climate scientists manipulate data. The evidence provided for that? Just one obscure graph found on a Substack. The next claim, global warming isn't a big deal. The evidence? Absolutely none. Bold, comforting claims are constantly made with a complete lack of supporting proof. And this actually brings up a really important point regarding the media environment, which our source describes as an asymmetric landscape. On one side, you have heavily funded punditry, on the other, scientific reality. The source neutrally reports on this funding asymmetry, observing how certain wealthy political interests can bankroll unprofitable media channels to artificially amplify these calm yet highly distorted narratives. It creates a deeply uneven playing field for the truth. Section 6. Escaping the data hellscape. Finding the truth. So, how do we actually find genuine hope rather than manufactured comfort? By looking at honest analysis and real data. We are seeing the decoupling of GDP and energy use in the US, meaning our economy grows, but we're using energy more efficiently. Globally, there is a massive rise in consumers choosing electric vehicles, and Europe is rapidly reducing its natural gas dependency. Real, untwisted data shows us that society is actively innovating. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from our source. Sensible progress requires honestly evaluating climate change and devising realistic strategies to address it. We simply cannot solve complex global challenges if we let subtle visual tricks and calm voices convince us the problem doesn't even exist in the first place. So, here's my final question for you. How are you going to evaluate the next calm, collected chart that crosses your feed? Will you look closely at the axes? Will you question the metric being used? Will you listen to how the presenter is preloading your thoughts with their choice of titles? I challenge you to apply this new playbook to the next perfectly polished but potentially surreal piece of data you encounter online. Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer.